coming up.
The air quality is very poor, and I don't want to get those particles deep in my lungs.
For the second time in June, a smoky haze from wildfires in Canada blankets parts of the US Northeast. Air pollution alerts are issued for several major cities.
It's covering a huge area at a scale that we haven't seen, at least in the data set that we have that covers the last 20 years.
Also in the US, university researchers reveal nearly half of honeybee colonies died there in 2022.
Are we really to be concerned about this?
Imagine if half the human population died, we'd be seriously concerned.
But first, Americans face extreme heat this summer, a season that's increasingly inhospitable to the urban poor and communities of color.
What is the weather like where you are in South Carolina?
It is hotter here. It's 86 degrees with pretty high humidity and smoke from the wildfires in Canada.
This is Just 2 Degrees on TRT World.
If you're in a part of the world where summer began in June and you thought the heat during that month was unbearable, you're not alone. Scientists have predicted that 2023 will be the hottest year yet. A report by the Center for America Progress looked at the insurance claims in the U.S. state of Virginia for a 5-year period. Researchers analyzed healthcare encounters for 5 summers from 2016 to 2020 to calculate the rate of emergency department visits for heat-related illness. Now, they found that hospitalizations due to heat-related illness increased significantly. Well, the authors of the study concluded that extreme heat will cost the United States $1 billion in healthcare costs in the summer of 2023 alone. From on this, we've got Durwood Zaelke back on Just 2 Degrees. He's a climate specialist based in South Carolina. Hi there, Durwood. It's always good seeing you. So this report does well to highlight the economic strain extreme heat is imposing on individuals, families, and the government.
Well, the extreme heat is going to affect every bit of society. I mean, it's going to affect the healthcare costs, as you're saying, and that's going to go way up. I think these numbers are very low compared to what we will see this summer and beyond. And of course, we're talking just about the United States for those numbers. So if you look at the global numbers, they're going to be much, much, much higher. But you're going to see the impact, as you just shown on your last segment, on bees and pollinators, which are, it's one of the factors that's hurting them. We have the challenge of the urban heat islands, where people talk about top floor deaths. So if you're poor, you're living on the top floor of a walk-up apartment, your apartment is going to be much hotter because the roof is so hot. People die first and foremost in the top floors of these types of apartment buildings. So that means that you need more cooling centers, you need more air conditioning. And as you put air conditioning on, you're causing more climate change. It's one of those unfortunate feedback loops. You cause more warming because for several ways. You're using fossil fuels, which produce the CO2 emissions, primary greenhouse gas, but you're also using HFCs, or hydrofluorocarbons, and other types of refrigerants that also are super climate pollutants. So you get this cluster of impacts, and then you take heat from the inside of a building, you move it with an air conditioner to the outside. Well, that creates more heat in an urban area. And so that means that the people who live in those places need more shade, they need more water, they need smart surfaces that reflect heat and make it livable.
It wasn't too long ago we were talking about the economic cost of stronger storms in states like Florida, California. Now another report talks about heat-induced lost labor productivity alone costs the entire U.S. about $100 billion a year. Is Washington looking into protecting public health, infrastructure against extreme heat?
This is going to be a huge problem for the United States and for the entire world. the prediction of the scientists are that there'll be a couple of billion people in the next decade or 15 years who will live in places that is too hot for humans to survive. That means mass migrations. In the United States, yes, the Biden administration is definitely paying attention, as are many states that are suffering. Texas right now is, of course, suffering an extreme heat wave, and it has been for several days. And this goes back to the Arctic as well. So if we want to prevent these extreme heat waves, we have to keep the jet stream stable. And that means keeping the Arctic reflective sea ice, which we're losing at an accelerated rate. That could be gone in 10 to 15 years. And that's going to add a tremendous amount of new warming to the system, equivalent of about 25 years worth of emissions. So, but the Biden administration is doing a good job. And both in the EPA side, the Department of Energy side, the State Department side for the international work. And they're paying attention to the urban heat islands. And many states, California being probably the leader on this, New York doing well also, appointing heat officers. This is a new position. They need somebody dedicated to keeping enough cooling during a heat wave to keep the citizens who live in that city safe.
On a resident level as well, talk about the disparity across different communities in the US. I mean, severe weather, climate change, extreme heat affects communities of color and poorer communities a lot differently than everyone else.
Yeah. So there's a wonderful group that I'm an advisor to called the Smart Surfaces Coalition, dedicated to improving the urban environment by having reflective roofs, reflective streets, reflective sidewalks, planting more trees, otherwise finding ways to manage the sun and the rainwater as well. And their studies show that if you go from a wealthy neighborhood where there's ample tree cover and much cooler environment, partly because of the shade, partly because of transevaporation from the trees. And then you move across the railroad tracks, proverbially, into the poor neighborhoods. They have far fewer trees. They have more black asphalt, far less shade, and they're much, much hotter. So there is a climate justice component here that the Biden administration is addressing. And this is something that the US EPA administrator is making one of his priorities.
Durwood, on a personal level, what is the weather like where you are in South Carolina? Is it extremely hot?
Well, it is. It's hot. So I drove this morning from Washington, D.C. down to my beach house that I inherited from my in-laws. Wonderful people whose ghosts still inhabit this old house. And it is hotter here. It's 86 degrees with pretty high humidity and smoke from the wildfires in Canada. So I thought I would leave that behind in Washington, D.C. It's about 400 miles almost north. And I didn't. It is here still in South Carolina.
Wow, I feel for you, sir. I really hope you get through that because it is still getting hotter. I mean, summer has only barely begun. All right, I wish you the best of luck. Always great speaking with you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, meanwhile, wildfires in Canada by the end of June released more than 160 million tons of carbon. That's according to the EU's Copernicus Atmospheric Monitoring Service. This haze, wow, is no joke. There were air quality alerts and recommendations to remain indoors as authorities linked the smoke to higher rates of heart attacks, strokes, and respiratory conditions. This year's wildfire season is the worst on record in Canada. Thousands of fires burned across 76,000 square kilometers in eastern and western swathes of the country. The smoke also affected parts of the eastern United States and reached as far away as Spain.
Yes, I am 87, reaching to 88, and I have to be careful that this thing do not affect my health and my lungs. So that's why I'm wearing the mask to make sure.
I've lived here for nearly 47 years, and I find that this is the most polluted time. So it's becoming worse.
A new report by the UK environmental body, the Climate Change Committee, says Britain's performed poorly in tackling the environmental crisis and shows a lack of real progress and odd decision-making. Analysts say the country's lost its position as a global leader on climate action and isn't doing enough to meet its mid-century target of going net zero by 2050. In 2019, the UK was the first of the group of 7 wealthy nations to require its citizens to make major changes in the way they travel and use electricity. But researchers say the country is now undermining itself, despite having recorded temperatures as high as 40 degrees Celsius last year.
I mean, the UK founded the Powering Past Coal Alliance, for example, was one of the first countries to commit to a date to phase out coal, and yet we're giving the go-ahead for a new coal mine, which will keep producing coal for decades beyond the point where industry can be using coal, really. So we could be going gung-ho for heat pumps. We could be going gung-ho for onshore wind, but at the moment, the planning system it imposes a sort of de facto ban on new onshore wind, which the government could lift to help speed up decarbonisation of electricity. And on planning, we are still building homes that are being connected to the gas grid, that don't have renewables built into them, that don't have decent energy efficiency standards. So basically, we're still building the problem rather than the planning system tackling the problem.
Well, it seems demonstrations and climate change awareness programs in Germany are paying off. Figures from the Agriculture Ministry show that meat consumption dropped to 52 kilograms per person in 2022, and that's down from 61 kilograms 5 years ago. These pictures are from the Vegan Summer Festival in Berlin. Patrons got a taste of a variety of plant-based products, like the vegan version of something called Berlin Currywurst. That's traditional German smoked sausage served with spiced and curry-flavored tomato sauce, as well as vegan tacos. But the main reasons for the drop in meat consumption are animal welfare and, of course, climate crisis.
Der Fleischkonsum ist in den letzten Jahren kontinuierlich gesunken. Er ist allein in den letzten 10 Jahren um 15% niedriger geworden und ist auf einem historischen Niedrigstand von ungefähr 60 Kilo auf jetzt ungefähr 52 Kilo. Und wir begrüßen das natürlich sehr. Einerseits ist es natürlich gut für die Tiere in der Massentierhaltung, es ist gut für den Klimawandel und es ist gut für die Menschen und ihre eigene Gesundheit.
The European Union's deforestation legislation came into force on June 29th. The rules are meant to guarantee that products EU citizens consume do not contribute to deforestation or forest degradation worldwide. The destruction and expansion of agricultural land is linked to the production of beef, palm oil, and cocoa. Under the regulation, traders who place commodities like leather, chocolate, or car tires on the EU market must be able to prove the products do not originate from recently deforested land. The US Department of Agriculture says 35% of our diet comes from insect-pollinated plants, and 80% of that work is done by the honeybee. But an annual survey by the University of Maryland and Auburn University revealed the honeybee industry is struggling to cope with major losses.
Tiny bees do a big job for the environment, pollinating flowers, trees, and even our crops. But an annual survey in the US recently revealed something alarming. Nearly half of managed colonies have been wiped out this year.
This year is among one of the highest year in terms of winter loss, and particularly for commercial beekeepers. So the industry in beekeeping is really split up between, on this large scale, between small-scale beekeepers that only manage a few colonies, all the way to commercial beekeepers that can manage thousands of colonies at a time.
It's the second largest die-off of American honeybees on record for commercial beekeepers, large and small. Scientists say it's normal to lose around 21% of hives over the winter. Last year, 48% of commercial bees were lost, and 39% the year before. In 2020, the loss was more than 50%. A parasitic mite that transmits viruses Varroa destructor, is the main problem. But bad weather and pesticide use has exposed bees to more diseases, making it harder for them to collect pollen. Another problem has been the use of one crop in wide areas, denying bees the plant diversity that provides them with a variety of nutritious food.
So there is a lot of things that can kill colonies, but we usually group what we call the risk factors into those big categories: pests and disease, pests and parasites and the disease that are associated with them, pesticides, poor nutrition, and then poor management.
Keeping their businesses and their bee colonies alive is a costly and time-consuming process of splitting and restocking their hives, finding new queens, and starting new colonies. The survey found that even with the die-offs, these techniques are keeping colony numbers stable. But with their role in nature, the ongoing health of commercial and wild bees is a cause for concern.
Bees and all pollinators are integral to our ecosystems and to our food production. When we talk about bees, most people think of something like Apis mellifera, a managed honeybee, but there's thousands of bee species in the United States. Some of them are extremely specific that only pollinate a small family of flowers native to your area, whereas some of them are generalist pollinators. We often are really interested in these generalist pollinators, and they can be the European honeybee, or they can be bumblebee species, because they can pollinate a large number of our agricultural crops.
So taking care of them is taking care of us, too. Sarah Balter, Just 2 Degrees.
We've got Dave Goulson on the program to talk about this. He's a biology professor at the University of Sussex and specializes in bumblebees. Professor, it is always good to connect with you. Firstly, this figure, 48% of honeybee colonies in the US dying last year. Are we really to be concerned about this, you think?
Yeah, sure. Imagine if half the human population died, we'd be seriously concerned. It's clearly worrying. It's not new. For the last 15 or so years, it's been quite common for beekeepers to lose 30, 40, 50% of their colonies every winter. And they just about manage to replace them every spring by splitting their colonies, but they're kind of teetering on the edge. And if bee colony deaths get much higher than this, then the whole population will start to decline, and that will have catastrophic effects on crop pollination.
Point taken. In Sarah's report, she talked about the main reasons that bees were dying in the US were poor nutrition, parasites as well. Do you see a global warming, biodiversity loss connection here?
I think it's not primarily yet due to climate change. I think it's a combination of other factors. You've already mentioned some of them, things like this varroa mite, which transmits diseases, exposure to multiple pesticides used in modern farming, which particularly we know that some of them impair the immune response of the bees, which makes them more susceptible to those viruses. So these different threats interact. Plus, bees have a really monotonous diet these days. They're generally feeding on crops rather than in wildflower meadows full of different flowers.
Professor, someone made this comment to me recently, saying bees are so small, all they do is feed on nectar. How are they important to the planet? I'm sure you would do a much better job at answering that question than I would.
I'll do my best. So 80% of all the plant species on our planet need pollinating by some kind of insect, usually a bee, but it could be another type of insect. And 3/4 of the crops we grow wouldn't give a good harvest without insects to pollinate them. So everything from apples, strawberries, blueberries, tomatoes, even products like coffee and chocolate are dependent on insect pollinators of one sort or another. So you can't really exaggerate how important they are. Millions of people would starve if we were to lose our insect pollinators.
Fascinating. I know you specialize in bumblebee that species, bumblebees. Do you see any global warming threats to them at this time?
Yeah, bumblebees are a little bit different to honeybees in that they're big and furry as an adaptation to living in cool climates. Bumblebees tend to thrive in the mountains, right up into the Arctic Circle, but they don't like hot weather. And so we're seeing bumblebees disappearing from the edges of their ranges closest to the equator. Last year, the drought that we had in Europe, we had a really hot, long, dry summer, which just made all the flowers wilt. So there was no food for bees and other pollinators, which had a major effect at the end of the year. So they are in trouble, and climate is beginning to play a role in that.
What would happen? I hate asking this question. It makes me nervous. What would happen if all the bees on the planet were killed off completely?
That's extremely unlikely to happen. There are 25,000 species of bee. So it would be kind of strange if they were all to disappear. But if they did, then most of the plant species on the planet would eventually die because they wouldn't be setting seeds, which would have catastrophic effects for all terrestrial ecosystems. And it would be impossible for the 8 billion humans and increasing to have a healthy diet. So millions of us, perhaps billions of us, would starve. So it's really, would be absolutely cataclysmic for life on Earth.
Indeed. Professor, always good and enlightening speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, we need every available tool to combat the climate crisis, including bees. Well, now researchers have found a new ally, and a very surprising one.
Many gardeners see them as an annoying invasive plant that destroys their sandstones and spoils their sharp-edged landscapes. But what is a moss?
Moss is part of a group that we call non-vascular plants, meaning it doesn't have the usual plumbing that trees and shrubs have. The xylem and the phloem, those structures that help it to get water and sediments up into the plant. So because it doesn't have that plumbing, it needs to be quite small. So it hangs around on the soil. That's why most mosses are very, very small.
A study conducted by Australia's University of New South Wales describes mosses as the lifeblood of plant ecosystems. 50 international researchers found mosses were a significant part of soil in the urban spaces they were studying. They collected moss samples from more than 123 ecosystems across the planet, from tropical rainforests and polar landscapes and deserts, and determined that moss has numerous benefits, including protecting soil from erosion and mitigating the effects of climate change.
If you've seen moss growing on the soil, you know that there's not a lot of erosion. Things are pretty stable. But it also changes the chemistry of the soil. It changes the phosphorus, changes the carbon and the nitrogen. And our study showed that mosses actually store 6.43 billion, that's billion, tons more carbon than soils without mosses or without plants. So mosses are doing an amazing job by actually sequestering all that CO2 from the atmosphere and embedding it in the soil.
Another benefit of moss is they protect the soil from nematodes, plant pathogens that eat the roots of agricultural crops like potatoes. And mosses are strong. They can remain in suspended animation for decades and be reanimated with just a few drops of water.
We'd like to look now at the importance of mosses in urban systems, how we might use them to restore degraded urban environments, and really I'm hoping to educate the public about how important mosses are for sustaining healthy urban ecosystems.
And before we end this episode, take a look at this. From this angle, it looks like a fish, but it's not. It's an underwater robot that's helping marine researchers observe and protect ecosystems that have been overfished and polluted. And it does so by collecting samples in a minimally invasive way. It uses AI to autonomously navigate its location and blend into a coral reef environment while it takes eDNA samples and high-resolution video. The robotic fish has a soft, undulating tail that creates no turbulence while it moves. It's a meter long and weighs almost 10 kilograms out of water, and it can operate for 2 straight hours before its eDNA filter is emptied and its batteries need to be replaced. Until next time, bye.
touch me.